several different wives. One of the interesting things about Manasseh, he was not the oldest son of Hezekiah, and he was born during that extension God gave to Hezekiah, the extra 15 years of life that he gave him, because Manasseh was only 12, so that math adds up. And not really sure. There's not a lot of historical narrative about how Manasseh actually becomes king, but there was definitely a lot of intrigue going on. So one of the things that happened in Israel, and one of the problems they had from the times of the judges on, is especially originally when they were constituted as a nation by God, they were a theocracy. God was their king, and then they had judges that basically dealt with the disputes of the people. So God had laid out the law for the nation. If you read Leviticus, not only do we find the ceremonial law, we also find the civic law. So that's where you find what actually became known in the United States as natural law, was taken out of the Old Testament. That was handed down to Israel by God, and it was the laws that would govern the nation. Laws to settle disputes, laws to set up orders of restitution. All of that was included there. And what happened in Israel, though, is they developed a class system somewhat, and they had sort of an elitist system. And the elitist system that seemed to perpetuate from generation to generation eventually would be made up of family members of the kings. You know, like kings had a lot of kids, only one could be king. The rest became princes or princesses, and they had a lot of influence and sway. And they fell into the lie of believing that God, Jehovah, was just another regional deity. And so they often, even when the reformer kings came in and did away with idols, as soon as the reformer king was gone, you usually had another king come in, often very young, who would be influenced by this ruling class, for lack of a better term, of people that just continued on from generation to generation. It was made up of the wealthiest people of Israel. It's funny how nothing changes, right? Is there still somewhat of a ruling class in almost every nation today? And the answer is yes. There are people with positions of power that tend to pass those positions on to their children, and so on and so forth, as well as the wealth. And this was a common problem for them, and it seemed to come back every time they had a period of reformation and restoration. It seems that we had a young king who's easily influenced and makes mistakes, and then becomes very wicked and evil in all that he does. And Manasseh is not going to be an exception. Verse 2, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. That's a pretty solid introduction to his life, because that is what he did. And then we have a great deal of detail about what evil he actually did. So it gives us sort of a subheading for what's going to come in the next several verses. Now, these are not the only evil things that he did. We'll see some more later on. But what he's going to deal with next is how he imitated the abominations of the nations that God had pushed out of the land of promise. So the verse says, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. It's going all the way back to the days of the Canaanites when they were living in the promised land. You remember part of the reason God gave the land to his people was because he was kicking the other people out. He was punishing them for the level of depravity and wickedness they had been practicing for generations. And so he was pushing them out as a punishment for their sins, and then he was giving that land to his people according to his covenant promise to Abraham, that he would give him a land in a distant place. And Abraham had traveled by faith and had resided there, and his sons and their sons, and so on, until Israel had become a nation, a large enough group of people to actually be considered a nation, but they had no land of their own because they were in slavery in Egypt. And then in fulfillment of the covenant and the promise, God gave them this land. And he reminds them of why he dispossessed the people that were there. There was a reason. It was because of their abominable way of living. It was pretty horrific. If you've ever studied Canaanite history, everything that God says about them is absolutely true and bore out through archaeological records. And it even goes into further than what God even talks about in his word. They were truly a depraved people. But Manasseh follows in their example. So you see verse 3 begins to tell us what he did in following their example. So first of all, he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. It's amazing how quickly he's able to undo all the good that Hezekiah had done, all the reformation and restoration work that Hezekiah had done. Manasseh is able to completely destroy and put things back the way they were before his father had started his work of reformation and restoration that pretty much took his entire life. It's amazing how hard it is to do good and how easy it is to do evil. It is hard to build something solid. It is really easy to build something corrupt. And so Hezekiah has no problem destroying all the work of his father. He begins to rebuild, first of all, the high places, and it gives these things to us in a certain order. So the first thing he does is what we would call regional. The high places were located in various regions of Judah, and it gave the people the ability to go up onto a high piece of land, whether it was a hill or a mountaintop, or whatever was the highest piece of land in that particular area. They would plant a grove of trees, and that's a place where they would go up to worship their various idols. And each person would pretty much do what was right in their own eyes. They would worship the idol of their own choosing. It might be a form of Baal. It might be a form of the Asherah. It might be a form of Molech, Dagon. They may have even tried to worship God in an inappropriate way, the God who is the great I am, Jehovah. But they would go up to the high places, and the high places were more generic. They were just groves of trees where people would go up, and then there was sort of a generic altar there, and they could offer a sacrifice on their own terms to whatever God they chose to. So that's what the high places were. They were regional places of worship, so the people didn't have to travel to a temple or an altar that was constructed for the specific worship of a certain deity. And people liked that. It was convenient. It was easy. It was painless. You could do it on your own terms, do it whatever way you wanted. And so it was very popular. The other thing he does is he begins to erect specific altars. Here it says he erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah. So he's erecting altars to the fertility god and fertility goddess of the Canaanites. Baal and Asherah were the god of fertility and the goddess of fertility that the Canaanites worshipped and made offerings to in the hopes that the harvest would be plentiful. And so the children of Israel want to cover all their bases. They're still offering sacrifices to Jehovah, but at the same time they're offering sacrifices to the Baal and the Asherah as well, with the hope that they will always have a good harvest. And he does this. He begins to construct these altars in different places of the land, initially at least, probably usually in large metropolitan areas. That's generally where they built the temples to the idols or constructed an altar for the various idols. And he does something else. And again, we see the comparison to Ahab. So Old Testament scholars believe that Ahab was the most wicked king Israel ever had. They also then believe that Manasseh was the most wicked king Judah ever had. So at this point, the northern kingdom has been not only divided but conquered, and all that's left is the remnant in the southern kingdom, and that's what Manasseh is now king over. So Ahab was the worst king when Israel was an entire nation, and Manasseh is the worst king of Judah alone. So he did everything that Ahab had done and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. So on top of rebuilding the high places, which is a generic place where they could worship the idol of their choice, building specific altars for Baal and Asherah, he then also begins to worship the host of heaven. Now this is the worship of the sun, moon, and stars, which was very prevalent in the days of Hezekiah. That was something Hezekiah had to deal with as well. It was probably one of the most common forms of worship outside of worship of Jehovah in Israel during Hezekiah's day, because they didn't need altars necessarily for that. They just needed a skyline. They needed a place to go out and gaze at the sky. And they would often then worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, this is also very common to that part of the world, as well as other parts of the world. If you study Mayan religious practices, they were all centered around the host of heaven. If you study Incan, Aztec, so that would be in this hemisphere. If you study all of their various worship practices, they were all centered around the host of heaven. Also, interestingly enough, North America as well. If you go back and study ancient religious forms of worship, even before the Europeans came across, you can look at places like the Serpentine Mountain. Anybody ever been? I couldn't find anybody this morning. Has anybody here been to the Serpentine Mountain in Ohio? No. Oh my, someday we may have to take a field trip. Serpentine Mound is exceptionally interesting. It is a mound built in the shape of a serpent in Ohio. It's not far from here, really, maybe a couple hours, 3 hours drive. If you go over to the Serpentine Mound, it's built in a very specific way. The head of the snake points to two hilltops, which around here would be mountains. That's, so in Marion, if you put those hilltops, they'd look like mountains. But in Ohio, they just look like hilltops. But they're two very distinct hilltops, and the head of the snake is pointed right between the two of them, and at two different specific times of the year, the solstices, the sun rises directly in line with the head of that snake. And so it was built as a place where they could worship the host of heaven, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And there's some archaeological evidence, although they will not let them dig it, which would be an interesting dig. There is enough archaeological evidence before digging was stopped to prove that it was some sort of religious site. And so it's common that all the different people of that era would worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. And so that's something he falls into as well, in direct violation of the commandments of God. So verses 4 and 5, he built altars in the house of the Lord. So it wasn't good enough to build altars in the major metropolitan areas and to build the high places in each region. He also then begins to build altars to various idols within the courtyard of God's house, the temple itself. So he begins to build these altars, much as Ahab did as well, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." For he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. So there's a lot of artistic renditions of what this probably looked like. But there were various porches and a couple areas where there was a second story, and they were considered the courtyard areas, the courts outside of the temple building itself. They were walled off, and some of them had porches, what they called second stories, that were open air. And he built these altars there, which makes sense because they would have a great view of the skyline, and they were able then to offer sacrifices to the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, do you think God's going to be offended by that? Yeah, if the high places weren't bad enough and the altars in the metropolitan areas for Baal and Asherah weren't bad enough, he actually has the audacity to set up an area within the temple courtyard dedicated to the worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And not just dedicated to the worship and observation of the sun, moon, and stars, but also sets up an area where sacrifices can be offered to them, turning them into deities as well. So certainly God is going to be offended by this. And then number 6, his wickedness continues, again following in the footsteps of Ahab. He made his son pass through the fire. Now, without being too cruel, we want to be clear, though. You guys remember what we told you it meant to make your son pass through the fire. That's where they would sacrifice their children in a flame pit of some sort, usually in an act of sacrifice to Molech, but also at times as an act of sacrifice to Baal. It was a one-time deal that a person had to do. It usually involved the oldest son, and you did that as a sign of your commitment to your specific idol. And the irony of it is they would offer their children to these idols, and it was always an idol that represented fertility. So they would take their eldest son, their firstborn, and offer him as a sacrifice to a fertility god with the promise that they would have more children. At least that's what they believed. Didn't work out that way in many cases, but at least that was their mindset, and that's what they practiced. So that's what it means here. He actually took his eldest son at some point and passed him through the fire. Now in 2 Chronicles, it tells us he made his sons pass through the fire. So it's not a contradiction, it's just an elaboration. So in 2 Kings, we're getting the example of his eldest son, but then he also passed some of his other sons through the fire as sacrifices. And the reason most Bible scholars believe he did this was because he was worshiping multiple deities. He was worshiping not only Molech, but also Baal, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and possibly even the Asherah at times required a human sacrifice. And so he was offering multiple sons to appease all the various deities. More than likely, at some period they had a bad harvest, and he decided to add another deity to his list and made the ultimate sacrifice to that deity. What's fascinating about this particular verse, it's a parallel passage in 2 Chronicles 33 with 2 Kings chapter 21, is that it tells us the place in which he was doing all these things was in a place called the Valley of Ben Hinnom. Does anybody know what the Valley of Ben Hinnom was called in the days of Jesus? which, by the way, it's still called Ben Hinnom in the days of Jesus. It just has a Greek spin on the Hebrew words. It was called Gehenna. Gehenna is a Greek word that is associated with Ben Hinnom in Hebrew and fire. So it's a combination word, fire and the actual proper name in Hebrew, Ben Hinnom. And all Ben Hinnom is the name of a family, and then the prefix means son. So it's the son of Hinnom, the valley of the son of Hinnom. And then in the Greek, they attached a designation of fire to that henna, therefore it became Gehenna. And that's the valley that Jesus refers to when he's talking about hell. It's an illustration he uses because Gehenna became the dump of Jerusalem. It became the place where they burnt all the refuse. It's the only way they could do it and not have disease. So all the trash had to be hauled out of the city and disposed of, and the valley of Gehenna was a place where the fire was never put out because there was a constant stream of trash being thrown into the valley to be consumed in the fire. Otherwise, they would have had things rotting in the streets and disease would have been prevalent. So they understood the necessity of cleaning things, throwing the trash into an incineration site where they did burn it then. And so that's the valley that Jesus uses as a reference for hell, because it was considered a valley of death stretching all the way back to the days of Manasseh. Because not only did Manasseh offer his sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, he also practiced some things that God forbade. And he practiced some things that were exceptionally wicked. And some of these words in the Hebrew are very obscure words. They're not used in other places. So sometimes it's a little difficult to figure out exactly what they were talking about. And so when you see these terms, we'll just kind of go through it here. The parallel passage in 2 Kings is almost identical in the list of things that he was doing. It says, first of all, that he practiced witchcraft. Now, the Hebrew word for witchcraft is of uncertain origin, so we're not exactly sure when the word first started being used or how it was used, but we do know that it's a combination of other terms. And the best educated look at it and the way in which the Hebrew people themselves understood it down through the ages as they looked back upon their own historical narratives, such as 2 Chronicles or 2 Kings, was a person who practiced witchcraft used the Hebrew word anon, and the meaning of the word was basically some form of communication with demons or spirits. So this is not hearing from, and that's what's different about this from some of the words we're going to look at in a moment. This is not hearing from, this is speaking to. So it's not that he's casting spells like in a movie or something. It's that in some way he's doing some sort of incantation that he believes allows him to communicate with the spirit world. So we'll get into that in a moment, but you really understand the gravity of where this man is at as he becomes an adult. These are the things that he's practicing. And the Bible goes to great lengths to explain to us the depth of his wickedness. So he is practicing some form of spiritual communication with an unseen realm. He's really communicating with demons, or at least he thinks he is. He's doing that in order to communicate. He also used divination in this particular use of the term. Divination comes from a Hebrew word, nakash. It means observing of signs to predict. So the act of divination it's talking about here is you would look around you and you would try to identify signs that would help you to predict the future. Did you ever hear an old term, reading the tea leaves? That's an act of divination. Tarot card reading is a form of divination. It's looking at circumstances, the way in which the cards are flipped over, the way in which they appear, and looking at that as a sign, and then divining from that sign what the future holds. Got to be careful with that one. People in church can oftentimes slip into divination, I think, or at least cross a line when they start focusing too much on physical signs. Because really the idea of divination, if you just want to distill it down to its actual definition, it's using physical manifestations, natural physical manifestations, to determine the future. So reading into things, basically. So like I say, if I get up in the morning and it's raining, then I'm going to have a bad day. I just know it. If I get up in the morning, it's not raining, I'm going to have a great day. And how am I going to know if I'm going to have a great day or a bad day? Whether or not it's raining. That's divination in a very simplistic form. It gets much more complex than that for people who practice it, but that's a very simplistic example of divination. And of course, it gets more complicated. They're looking at things and then determining outcomes in future events based on the signs that they were looking for and things of that nature. So he's practicing divination, the use of signs to determine the future. Practice sorcery. This is probably another one of the obscure ones. And again, it probably has more in line with being able to somehow find extra knowledge and future predictions. I think the sorcery is tied in with the use of mediums and spiritists. Now that one we know a lot more about. That again is another thing in Israel in the very law of God in Leviticus that was forbidden. Anyone who caught playing the part of a medium or a spiritist was to be put to death immediately in Israel. During the time of the reformers, they actually took that seriously. Not so much in days of kings like Manasseh, who actually used mediums and spiritists. The idea behind a medium or a spiritist was that this person could communicate with the dead. That was the idea. And that then you could speak to dead loved ones, you could speak to them for advice or direction, or they just could channel various spirits, not just past loved ones, but anything that was considered to be an authority figure that could give you direction for life. So that was basically the way in which it functioned. Now, mediums and spiritists throughout biblical times were sometimes fake, sometimes they were just con artists, much as today. They simply gather information about people and then lead people through a series of questions. It's amazing how they do that. If you've never had a chance to watch somebody who actually exposes how they do that, you should. It's fascinating to watch. It's also very instructive if you don't want to be duped, because you can really see how they lead people into giving them all the information they need to make these crazy predictions, what seem to be crazy predictions. They're just gathering information by asking questions. And then they make general statements, very general statements. Like, if you ever watched it, and I watch it just because I want to educate myself. So I've watched a few people who claim to be mediums, and you quickly pick up on the tricks. So they'll say something very general. I'm seeing a young man with blue eyes. And people will just blurt out a name. And they'll say that name and says, yeah, he has something he wants to say. And oftentimes that person will actually talk about what they figure that person wants to talk about them about. Well, then that person has all the information they need to just play the whole game. And so they just kind of like play with people's minds, and that's the con artist part. But in biblical times, were there people who were talking to spirits? And the answer is yes. I could actually give you a couple passages where that is true. And were those spirits, what were they? Demons. The only one that's not a demon is, remember when Saul is looking for advice from what is referred to as the witch at Endor? And that's not a Star Wars movie, that is a biblical passage, right? He's looking for advice from the witch of Endor, and she summons a spirit, and he wanted to talk to who? He wanted to talk to Samuel. And she summons a spirit, and it appears to be Samuel, and Samuel speaks to Saul for a moment, and she is scared to death when Samuel appears, isn't she? So you'd think if that's what she does all the time and that's something she's able to do, she would not have been frightened when she actually summoned the spirit she was trying to summon. The point is, she was never summoning the actual people she claimed to be. It was either something else or all a con. And in that moment, she actually, for the first time in her life, summoned a true spirit, and it terrified her. The end result terrified her. So what is going on in most of these cases is they're probably communicating with demons. And the reason is, there's no such thing as ghosts. When people die, they go one of two places, according to the Bible. They either go to heaven to be with the Lord while they wait for the return of the Lord, or they go to hell to wait for final judgment. That's the destination. To believe that there is a ghost, the soul of a person, that would mean that God lost track of someone after they died. That would be the problem. But do I believe that people are communicating with legitimate spiritual entities? The answer is yes. I think they're just communicating with demons is who they're communicating with. And that's why messing around with mediums and spiritists is extremely dangerous. Either one, you're going to get conned, or two, you're going to get connected to something you don't want to be connected to. So Manasseh is probably getting conned and connecting to things he should not be connected with. And he continues that passage by saying this: he did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. So he's just continuing to add to his list of woes, his list of wicked things. Then he continues. So all this is kind of like building up to a crescendo, if you will. Verse 7, it's not enough that he put an altar in the temple courtyard for the sun, moon, and stars. He also sets out the carved image of Asherah. Now, I said earlier he made a carved image of Asherah, but now we find out what he made it for. That he had made in the house of which the Lord said to David and his son Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. So God's name was attached to the temple, as he promised. The temple was built in Jerusalem according to his specifications, and that's the place where the glory of God resided in Israel. Now, Manasseh puts an Asherah pole, which is all just it is. They cut down a tree and they would carve the face or the shape of the Asherah into the tree. And then they would set it somewhere, and that would be their idol. And so he takes this Asherah pole that he had made and he sits it somewhere in the house of God. And as I told him this morning, I'm pretty sure it was not the Holy of Holies, because he made it out alive after he sat it there. But I believe he sat it somewhere in one of the outer chambers, probably one of the outer chambers surrounding the Holy of Holies. He may very well have put it next to the altar of God, where they actually offered the sacrifices, because they did not offer the sacrifices in the inner chambers. They offered them in the outer chambers. And so he sets this somewhere in one of the outer chambers of the temple itself. So the altars to the sun, moon, and stars are out in the courtyard. The Asherah is placed in one of the inner chambers of the temple itself. So verse 8... let me go back. So read the last part of verse 7, then we'll read verse 8 to make more sense. So in the house and in Jerusalem, this is God speaking and reminding the children of Israel of the agreement that he made with them. He said, I promised that I would be there in the midst of you, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. I will put my name forever. And I will not make the feet of Israel wander anymore from the land which I gave their fathers. So in other words, he's reminding them of the promise he made, that he was going to plant them in the land and that he would provide for them and protect them, if only they will observe to do all according to all that I have commanded them and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. So he says, I'm going to plant you in the land. You'll never have to leave, because I'm going to protect you and provide for you, and you will stay there as long as you continue to observe my commandments and keep the law that I gave to Moses for you. So he's just reminding them there's a covenant agreement between him and Abraham, that this land would belong to Abraham's descendants. There was a covenant agreement with David that a descendant of David would sit on the throne, and there was a covenant agreement between God and the people that as long as they obeyed his commandments and followed his statutes, he would protect them and provide for them. And he had. Even what we looked at during Hezekiah's reign, where the Assyrian army is destroyed by God, and the Hebrew people don't even go to war with the Assyrian army. God destroys the Assyrian army without them. And so he does protect them. He does provide for them. He does watch over them. But the land and their ability to stay in the land and have a home of their own is dependent upon their obedience. And of course, we know they're being disobedient. And so the groundwork is being laid, even in the historical narrative of Israel, for the final destruction of Judah as well. 2 Chronicles 33:9, thus Manasseh, so all these things that he's doing, he misled Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to do more evil. And this particular passage tells us they were more evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel. So they not only followed in the pattern of the various Canaanite tribes, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Philistines, they followed in their footsteps and did the same things, but they became even more evil than those people were when God dispersed them from the land. Verse 9, back in 2 Kings 21, they did not listen to the prophets. It doesn't say the prophets, it just said they did not listen. What they did not listen to was the law of God and the prophets who were warning them about breaking the law of God. And Manasseh seduced them to do evil more than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel. So again, the same thing that we see in 2 Chronicles is spoken of again in 2 Kings, where he is leading them and they are following. Verse 10 and 11. Now the Lord spoke through his servants the prophets, saying, because Manasseh king of Judah has done. So here we have, again, this is a historical narrative. 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles are both historical narratives. They are actually summarizing the messages that the various prophets delivered to Manasseh and the people of Judah during his reign. As I said, if you want to find a book that really contains all prophecies about Manasseh, it's Micah. Micah chapter 7 in particular, sort of a summation as well of God's charge against the Jewish people who are following the example of Manasseh willingly. So verse 10 through 18 I'm going to read real quick. It's just a summary of the prophetic messages that various prophets delivered to the people during Manasseh's reign. So this is a summary. Because Manasseh, king of Judah, has done these abominations, having done wickedly more than all the Amorites did who were before him, and has also made Judah sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such calamity on Jerusalem and Judah that whoever hears of it, both his ears will tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will abandon the remnant of my inheritance and deliver them into the hands of their enemies, and they will become as splendor and spoil to all their enemies, because they have done evil in my sight, and have been provoking me to anger since the day their fathers came from Egypt, even to this day. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides his sin with which he made Judah sin in doing evil in the sight of the Lord. So we get one last thing that Manasseh was guilty of in verse 16. That the prophets exposed, and that was the shedding of innocent blood. Not everyone in Judah agreed with the direction Manasseh took the nation when Hezekiah passed away. Certain that Hezekiah had influenced quite a few people for the good, and many people had returned to faithful worship of the one true and living God. And they were not thrilled with what Manasseh was doing. So how did Manasseh deal with them? He simply killed them. So by the time you get towards the middle of his life, whatever was left of the actual remnant of Judah that worshiped God is gone. He takes out those who stand in his way, those who oppose the idolatry and the sorcery and the witchcraft that he's practicing. He just simply eliminates them, so they're not opposition at all. Before we go and finish, I do want to go back just a little bit to verses 10 and 11. I think I lost my place now. It's easy to do. So they've done more wickedly. I love that part. He reminds us that they were more wicked once again. So in the summary of the prophet's warning to them, or the prophet's message to them from God, is that God is saying to his people, you've become more wicked than the people who didn't even worship me. You're more wicked than the people who don't have the law. They didn't even have the written law. You have the written law. They had the law on their own hearts because they're created in my image the same way you are. But they had a written law, and you're more wicked than they are. So in spite of having the law, you just continue to be more wicked than even they were. It talks about the destruction then in verses 12 and 13. And there's a illustration at the bottom that I think everybody can identify with and to fully understand what is about to happen. He says, and I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. Now, I do a lot of dishes. I'm sure everybody here has to do some dishes, right? We do have a dishwasher. We put some stuff, but we wash a lot of our dishes just in the sink. I'm not buying those commercials that say you use less water if you run your dishwasher. I'm always suspicious when the dishwasher company that sells you the detergent for the dishwasher is telling you to use the dishwasher because it'll save you money. I'm not sure I believe them. I don't use that much water when I wash my dishes in the sink. I put a little bit of water and soap in the bottom, I scrub, and I rinse them off real quick. When I wash a dish, though, what you do is whatever food is on it, you wash off, right? That's what he's talking about. You wipe the dish, and you wipe it, and you wipe it until it's clean. Then you rinse it in clean water, and you turn it upside down. What do you turn it upside down for? To get the rest of the water off of it as well. So by the time your dish is in the strainer and done drying, there's absolutely nothing on your dish. Not the food and the stuff that was on there when you started washing it, not even the water that you washed it with. So what God is saying to them is this: I'm going to completely cleanse Jerusalem. There's not going to be anything left. There's not going to be anyone left. Everyone that will be in Jerusalem in a short period of time will not be Hebrew. There will not be any Hebrew people. No descendants of Abraham will be in Jerusalem, and it's not that far away. I'm going to completely cleanse it of the Hebrew people. Now, that's a pretty stark warning. What's fascinating about this historically is some things happened in Israel. The northern kingdom, as you know, the northern 10 tribes, they were conquered first. They were conquered by several nations, but primarily the Assyrians. And the way the Assyrians dealt with conquered nations was they left a majority of the people in the nation that they conquered there, because the expectation was they would farm and run their flocks, and the Assyrians would take most of the produce. They would take most of the harvest, and they would take most of the flocks. They would leave enough for the people living there to survive so that they can continue to farm on their behalf. And they would either consume those items or they would sell those items for more wealth. And that's how the Assyrians built their empire. But they would also then carry off the youngest and the strongest as slaves. And they would replace them with people from other nations. And so that's how they intermingled people. They would move people around so that a nation would not have a national identity anymore, because they felt like people with national identities tended to rise up in rebellion over time. So they would separate families and mix the people together with people from other places. And that's how they controlled the various areas that they conquered. So what happened in the northern kingdom is that a good number of the young people were carried off. They were replaced by other people, and that's where the Samaritans came from in Jesus' day. They were people who had mixed heritage. They were Hebrew and pretty much every part of that part of the world. People from Phoenicia, people from Assyria, people from Babylon, because Babylon for a while was a vassal state of Assyria. All the different regions around the smaller tribes, like even the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Ammonites, all those various tribal areas had been conquered by the Assyrians. And so they intermingled those people around, so there was no more national identity. So in the days of Jesus, that's why you see the people in Judah look so negatively at the people in the northern kingdom, because most, if not all of them, had intermarried with Gentiles. Now, Judah is going to suffer a different fate. Judah is going to be completely decimated. All the people are going to get carried off into Babylon later on. So by the time God passes judgment on Judah, Assyria has been destroyed. Babylon is the new dominant empire. And Babylon practices a completely different way. They practice a completely different way of subjugating nations. So Babylon, in their mentality, they take everyone that they don't kill and they carry them off to Babylon. Now, they don't bring them right into the nation itself. They plant them somewhere on the perimeter of Babylon where they can keep control of this much smaller group of people, because they usually killed the vast majority of people of any land they conquered. But they want enough because they want to be able to use these people as slave labor. So again, they keep the best, the youngest, the strongest, and they subjugate them then on the border of Babylon. They take the youngest, such as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they take them into Babylon to re-educate them so they can send them back to lead these conquered nations. So that's their mentality. That's the way in which they function. So the people of the southern kingdom never intermarried with Gentiles. They got taken as a whole, moved from Judah to Babylon, planted there, it says by a river, so they had a place where they could survive and thrive, and they were left there as a group. Only the youngest men were taken to Babylon itself, and usually they had to be of royal descent, so they would be recognized by the people as leaders, and they were then educated in the ways of Babylon. Completely different way. So in the days of Jesus, what has happened is the people of Judah, that southern kingdom, had eventually been allowed to return back to Jerusalem and rebuild, and they were 100% Hebrew. The northern 10 tribes were almost all intermarried and intermingled with Gentile people, and therefore they were looked down upon by the southern kingdom. And once again, the southern kingdom in the days of Jesus had thrived far more than the northern kingdom. So Judah and Benjamin, the final two tribes that were pure Hebrew, if you will, they had not intermarried with Gentile people, They thrived more than the 10 tribes in the north did. But again, 10 tribes in the north, because they're intermarried with Gentiles, had no interest in Judaism, had no interest in worshiping God in the temple. They had built their own temple in the northern kingdom once again and were worshiping God in an inappropriate way. Hence the conversation between Jesus and the woman at the well. Remember that conversation, right? That's what he points out to her. You guys aren't even worshiping God according to Hebrew law. So you don't know what you're doing. You say you're worshiping God, but you don't even know how. That's why that conversation goes the way it goes. So everybody with me on the history? Did it make sense? So now you're beginning to see what's happening here. So all this because of Manasseh, this taking away of Judah. But God is going to maintain Judah because it's part of the Davidic covenant. What separates Judah and Benjamin out from the rest of Israel is that there is another covenant besides the one with Abraham, and that's the one with David. So David has to have a descendant that descends directly from his line, both man and woman, in order to have a child that is part of the Davidic covenant to sit on the throne. They both have to be descendants of David. So that's why Judah is kept pure, so that God can fulfill all of his prophetic promises. So it's a really fascinating topic as to why everything happens the way that it does. But it all has a purpose and a reason. And what he's doing here is he's completely removing the nation. He's using the Babylonian Empire to do it, and he's relocating them as a group so that eventually he can bring that group back. All right, so verse 16, again, we see the shedding of innocent blood, the killing of anyone who tries to stand in his way. Verse 17, now the rest of the acts of Manasseh and all that he did and his sin which he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And the answer is yes. All of that is recorded in those places. Manasseh slept, which means he passed away, with his fathers, was buried in the garden of his own house, in the garden of Uzzah, and Ammon his son became king in his place, and the time of Judah is nearly at an end at this point. God has already passed judgment. The Babylonians are coming, and it's nearly the end of Judah. Again, as I said, if you want to see a prophecy that's directed directly at Manasseh, it would be Micah chapter 7, verses 1 through 20, or more specifically 1 through 17. I will read a quick portion, then I'm going to finish. So Micah chapter 7, verse 18, there is the end of Micah's prophetic ministry. He was probably martyred for his prophetic ministry. Most traditions believe that Micah was killed by Manasseh for his constant prophesying against his actions. But he makes a promise. He's given a promise by God. He makes that promise to the people as God's messenger. Who is a God like you who pardons iniquity? And keep in mind, this is in spite of all the people turning against God, putting an Asherah pole in the temple, worshiping the sun, moon, and stars in the temple courtyard, going up to the high places and worshiping whatever idol they preferred, offering sacrifices, some of them even sacrificing their own children for the purpose of fertility. On it goes. All of that. In spite of all that, God still loves them and is still holding out an offer of forgiveness. So verse 18, who is a God like you who pardons iniquity and passes over the rebellious act of the remnant of his possession? He does not retain his anger forever because he delights in unchanging love. So God is going to punish you in a way that you will finally recognize the sin of your lives. But he still loves you. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. Yes, you will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. You will give truth to Jacob and unchanging love to Abraham, which you swore to our forefathers from the days of old. And so even at the end of all that, with all the wickedness that Manasseh perpetuated throughout the people, as much as the people joined in with him wholeheartedly, it wasn't hard for him to get things done like it was Hezekiah. The people went right along with it. God still loves them. Yes?
Back in 16, it says, moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem and went into the earth. Do you think that is an exaggeration?
No.
The Battle of Armageddon, when the blood is going to be up to the horse of that.
No, I don't think it was deep. I just think he meant there was blood on all the streets. I think what happened, from what we can tell, so some of these things we pick up some from not biblical history, but Jewish history. So the Jewish people have a history of their existence outside of the Bible as well. There were many Jewish historians. But according to their legends, if you will, which I think are probably pretty accurate, and they seem to match up with the biblical narrative, when Manasseh takes the throne, a lot of the people have actually been reformed and restored. So Hezekiah had an uphill battle. Most of the people, the majority of people, never really changed, but a lot did. So when he comes into power, he immediately starts to put these altars to these idols all over the place. And from what we can tell, there was a significant number of people, nowhere near a majority, but a significant number of people who stood up and tried to oppose him. And specifically, it appears they tried to oppose him in Jerusalem. And his reaction was to simply kill them in the streets. That's outside the Bible, but it does match what the biblical testimony says. And so there wasn't a war or a battle. There was just a execution, if you will, of all those who refused to go along with his program, all those who refused to join him in his sin. And I don't think it was a huge number of people, but I think it was a significant number of people. And he had no problem with that. And you can imagine, if a man wants to communicate with demons and he's going to put an altar to the sun, moon, and the stars in God's temple and an Asherah pole within the chambers of the temple itself, he's not going to have a problem killing a few people who oppose his agenda. So I don't think it was running deep like you're talking about when you talk about the Revelation. I think that just meant that there were a lot of people killed and there was a lot of blood spilt throughout the streets of Jerusalem. Yes? Yes. Right. But they were what we would call like grafted into the family, and they converted to Judaism. The problem in the northern kingdom is that when the Gentiles intermarried with the Jewish people, the Jewish converted to Gentile religion rather than the Gentiles converting to Judaism. So you're talking about those Old Testament examples. They at least had converted to following the commandments and the law of God. But there were actually a lot of people in Israel who were not native-born Hebrews. Such as in the days of Solomon, there were at least 250,000 people in Israel that were practicing Judaism by choice, which is often overlooked. They were not considered proselytes. They were considered practicing Jews. And they were grafted into the Hebrew people and able to marry Hebrew women or men and still be considered, they would still be considered Hebrew. So that's the difference. And the difference with the Samaritans is they adopted Gentile culture rather than the Gentiles adopting Jewish culture or religion. Yes. Yeah, he actually gave in to his wives and let them bring their own with them and even built cities and towns for them to practice their own, therefore co-opting much of Israel and really sowing the seeds of all this. That was the introduction of all these gods back into Israel and all these various cities. So each city, what they did was they gradually adopted the deities of various tribes from the region so that you wouldn't see the same deities worshipped from one town to the next. That's how many different gods there were in Israel, which made Israel the most idolatrous nation in the area, actually, which is amazing.